and we're going to start off talking about St. Vincent's Mass Seduction, and this one has been a very anticipated release. For me, a little brief history. Of course, St. Vincent, the sort of alias of Annie Clark, was a musician, played in Sufjan Stevens' band for Illinois, I think, during that tour. So sort of, was working class, working her way up. Eventually released her debut, Marry Me, back in 2007. Formed a partnership with John Congleton, and they made some incredible albums together with John Congleton as producer. The sort of great streak from Actor to Strange Mercy to the self-titled St. Vincent album. Super incredible releases, with the latter being sort of a breakthrough for St. Vincent, as that album, it won her a Grammy. She toured a bunch for it. Kind of got into the celebrity limelight during that time as she was dating Cara Delevingne. And we're now at Mass Seduction 3 years later, or 3 years since the self-titled release. And I've got some thoughts on it, but I feel like, I want to start off, but I know some folks, they just, you don't want to hear it, because I've been discussing it in the chat all week, and, every single time, there's always, one person that's just like, So, you know what, we're going to let some other takes come out first. So, I'm going to select someone. AJ.
Cool.
Let's talk.
Yeah, I know for a fact, pretty sure that I think out of all the members of the podcast, I'm the hottest on this album. I really do quite enjoy this album a bit. I haven't really thought about where it kind of falls in her category. I've just sort of been like listening to and enjoying this album, not really kind of stewing on it as much as it relates to her other stuff. But every St. Vincent album is sort of like her putting on a persona and is like a whole cohesive, I'm doing big air quotes here, art experience rather than just like an album that comes out. Like there's sort of like, what does Annie look like while she's promoting this album, and what is kind of like the art and the rollout for it sort of look like. So much so that like it's sort of inescapable and definitely kind of plays into how the album, like how you come to the album as a listener. And it's all very planned out. It's not like, oh, like the marketing is ruining the album, whatever. It's very planned out on her part, because she is this kind of like cohesive artist with a vision. And so the Mass Seduction kind of rollout, I think, was purposefully divisive from the very beginning. Like there's a big old tush on the cover of this album. You gotta talk. It's very in your face, folks. Like you're not getting away from this, and it's colorful and it's kind of loud, and definitely the poppiest thing Annie's ever done. And I don't think that is necessarily bad, because here comes the take, and this is sort of, I think, the make or break thing for a lot of people on the album, is that she did work with noted evildoer Jack Antonoff. Produced, I think a fair bit of this album, actually.
He co-produced the entire thing with Annie.
Yeah, and I mean worked very closely. When you say co-produced, that's a good, like it was kind of a cohesive vision that the two of them sort of shared. They worked together to do this, and I think as with like all of the stuff he touches, his influence is sort of unmistakable. Like you can hear it and go, fuck, I know this like Bleachers looking motherfucker. I can imagine him going, what if we did this here? Like what if on Sugar Boy we like put in the riff from Los Angeles in the back half of the bridge, and it's like, that's so cool, which actually does work very well. Sorry to kind of call it out. But like when you listen to the new Lorde and the new Taylor Swift stuff, it's very obvious where you can tell his influence. I do think Mr. Antonoff has never kind of like worked better than he does in this album, and it goes sort of hand in hand with, like I was talking about earlier, like the projected persona that Annie puts on for this album, which is very scorned, very angry, very queer, and very feminine. It's just very in-your-face, like sexual relationship. We're going to talk about this drama, we're going to talk about drugs, and we're going to talk about these bright neon in-your-face colors that you can't escape, like on Pills, which is, I hate to do it to him, reminds me of some of the songs on Everything Now, in being that it's, an idea for a song that you, as the listener, need to sort of to come to terms with, rather than you are sort of like enjoying this song on its own merits. So I get that sticks out for a lot of people as a sort of, bad note on this album. I do think it was a very strange choice for a single, but the way it plays in the album I think is very cool. But songs like Mass Seduction and Sugar Boy, I already gave a shout out to, Savior, Young Lover, are these like big sort of like breathless, fast, and in-your-face pop songs that I'm just like, that's good. Annie's voice has always been her strong suit, and it's all over the place on this album. to some good and to some bad. I think a lot more good than a lot bad on this album. And then the slower tracks are sort of, I think, the standard St. Vincent slow tracks that you're sort of getting the ballads like Happy Birthday Johnny. Dancing with a Ghost and Slow Disco play beautifully into each other. Every time I listen to this album, I'm just like, damn, she really did that. And then Smoking Section's a great closer, again, using her voice in really creative ways. So I do think that this is sort of like a very carefully designed album, and that it's going to bounce off a lot of people just because of how sort of uncompromising it is, and a little bit of a far cry from her older stuff. I do think it obviously sounds the most like the 2014 album, and I don't think it's very far off from that sound, but it is, instead of like ripping guitars and gritty solos, it's like we're going full on pop with this thing, baby. And so I see what she was doing with it. I like it. I really dig this album. It's in the upper half of my favorites for the year. I've always been a big St. Vincent fan, and so like seeing her kind of reach this point where it's so cohesive a vision and so kind of like realized a persona that she's putting on for it is cool to see, and I'm definitely into it. But I know that it rubs a lot of people the wrong way, so I'm curious to hear what you guys don't like about this album.
Oh boy. Wait, Josiah, yeah.
I'll go a little.
Just rip
No,
because like
I'll save my takes for last, because
I think that I'm like somewhere in between, and I think we should kind of go from positive to negative almost.
Yeah, I'm probably in the same place.
Okay, fine.
I think that like I will concede that what AJ said about like Jack Antonoff kind of working on this record is kind of right. I think that like his very distinct sugary pop style can't, like, I don't think it worked with Lorde. Like, that's just, I'll get that out of the way. I think that it works better here, and I think that, like, conceptually, I was pretty okay with, like, everything going into this record, except that I didn't really like the singles. And I think that my big problem with this is that, like, I wanted to like this. I'm okay with, like, Annie Clark doing basically an alt-pop album, like, breaking, not really into the mainstream, but as far into the mainstream as possible for her. Like, that's cool. I think that if, like, as far as an alt-pop record goes, this, production-wise, is, like, pretty good. And, like, writing-wise is, it's fine, but, like, what kind of annoys me is that for a pop record, I, for the life of me, like, cannot remember almost any of the hooks on this album except for Pills, and I don't like the hook on Pills. Like, for some reason, the singles are, like, some of my worst favorite, or my least favorite songs on this. Like, I'm down with Sugar Boy. I like Savior, Fear the Future, and like really a lot of the latter half. But like something about the first half is just like, I want to like this, but for me, there's just like there's something off about it, and maybe that's the point conceptually.
I would say yes, is that it's sort of by design, I think, a confrontational album, especially when you like consider the sort of the like source material for a lot of it was like her breakup, and sort of her big official coming out sort of is just like, this album is kind of the like, I'm here, I'm queer, I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore. And so I think like by design, purposefully, a lot of that will bounce off of some of her like established audience, and not based on anything like weird or obviously like whatever it has to do with that. But I just think that like I definitely see that this is the album she wanted to make, and she did the damn thing, and it doesn't really, like, you know, if people are going to not like it, then that is sort of there. She knew there were going to be people that don't like it.
Yeah. And she kind of almost acknowledged that in one of those Instagram videos where it was like, people are either gonna like love this new image as with every album, or be cranky about missing the old Annie. And like, I'm kind of in between. Like, there's a lot of things I like about it, and I think that there's just like things in execution that I get a little hung up on.
Yeah. So my relationship with this is a little interesting, because like, so I wasn't really like a big St. Vincent head before this album. Like, I'm not, like, I've listened to I've listened to Strange Mercy a bunch of times, and I've listened to the self-titled a couple times, and so like I am aware of Saint Vincent, but like I feel like I was pretty unbiased going into this just because I didn't have like a strong emotional attachment either way. I wasn't like, no, they're ruining Annie. I wasn't like one of those kind of people, because like I was just like, oh, cool. Like I'm interested to see where this new thing goes as someone who follows the Saint Vincent project but wasn't particularly emotionally invested in it. And yeah, this album for me is, I would say, a mixed bag. I think for the most part, there are only a couple parts of this album where I'm like, absolutely no. Like I think this album is not like Everything Now, where there are like a number of really like objectionable things. Which don't get started, AJ. I'm not trying to bait you here, but like this is more
well,
of like
fine, baby.
Everything with this album is like, there's like one or two things where I'm like, I don't like this at all, and then a lot of it is just kind of like middle of the road for me, and there aren't really any like crazy big like blowing me away highlights, but it's mostly enjoyable. I like that she decided to make a pop album. I'm glad that she decided to make a pop album, and I honestly, I said this in the chat the other day, but Jack Antonoff isn't good, but he's also not bad. And at this point, after 2017, I just have no idea how I feel about him, and I cannot separate like music industry narratives and from him, and I don't know how I actually feel about him, and I'm just very confused. So I'm trying to just think about this album as an album instead of what it means, the future of Jack Antonoff in the music industry, which appears to be booming these days. But I like it. I like Melodrama a lot better than this, but I also think that Jack works better here than he does on Melodrama, because the stuff that really like enchants me about Melodrama is just that like Lorde is one of the most like capable, incredible young songwriters in the pop world. Like, she really is like the realest of real deals, and I didn't think like, I thought that her songwriting style and Jack's songwriting style doesn't really mesh together super well. But then I think that St. Vincent and Jack actually work pretty well together on this. Like, some of my favorite St. Vincent stuff is like the hook on Cruel, like that kind of like poppy, and then incorporating that with kind of weirder stuff in, you know, like Cruel has that incredibly infectious hook, and it has those super noisy, crunchy guitars on it, and it's like kind of the contrast of having like a very poppy, ear-grabbing song that is also so left field and weird. And so I don't know, like in general, like this album, like I think that was a really good point, Josiah, saying like the hooks on this album are not strong enough for this to be Annie's big in-your-face pop album. Like I should be like humming all of these songs, like, oh boy, that's a knee slapper, right? That was a catchy tune, and like they're very enjoyable. When the couple of times I put on this album, I'm like, this is fun. I like this, but it's just not like sticking with me. You know, it's we're out here on Reasonable Take Island, moderately enjoying this, but not getting too excited about it. It might make my year-end list. It might not. I'm not exactly sure. That's basically my take.
Oh boy. Okay. Well, okay.
Lay it on.
Okay. Just off the bat, let me just say, I'm not that into this album. I am very disappointed by this album. The singles leading up to it, obviously, I think like most people were not that into them, and I was very worried going into this album. New York came out, and I was like, oh, this is not good. Like, this is just like a really kind of mediocre piano ballad that like tries to have this like pastiche and like this sort of epicness to it, and it's like, no, the writing is just not good enough for me to be like, oh man, I really feel this song. It just seems like it's like, you know, it's trying to be like this sort of emotional ballad, and it's like, no, there's a personal touch that's just not here. So I don't believe this. Like, it just like songs like The Party off of Actor, like those songs fucking that song fucking hits me. Like that's a fucking great song, and it really just like grabs me emotionally. And New York just did not do that, and I was like, okay, well, it's a kind of a promo first single. We'll see how, you know, let's see how things develop. And then Los Angeles comes out, and you know there was some hype for it, and I was like, okay, you know, it seems like, you know, we're back to kind of normal Annie, and I was like, oh, this is not great. And I'm actually like right now like trying to remember the tune of the song, and I cannot. Like, I listened to this album like an hour before we did this podcast, and I still can't quite recall the tune of this song. It's like I'm trying to remember, because I literally just remembered it like before I was talking, but then I forgot it, and I'm trying to refine it again. But Los Angeles was like also like really like underwhelming, because it was like it had all these elements that I like about Saint Vincent, because you got those crunchy guitars, you got those, sort of the slick pop song sort of writing, but still kind of mixed in with the juxtaposition of the crunchiness. But it had all these elements, but they just weren't in the right order, and something was missing, and I was like, ugh, like, I wonder what it is. And Pills kind of was the kind of like, oh, this is not great. This is just, oh boy. Like, basically I want to say Jack Antonoff is he's only a catchy songwriter when he's being fucking annoying. Like, when his songs are fucking annoying, that's when he's catchy. Like, Look What You Made Me Do is only catchy because it's so goddamn annoying. And, like, ugh. But Pills was also, like, just the hook was bad, but some of the stuff in the verses was pretty cool. Like, I like some of the horns, and I like, some of the, you had the good crunchy guitar stuff, but it was just a mess of a song. But the entire album as a whole is just very disappointing, as, it's just, like, first and foremost, the songs, they aren't there for me. Like, just nothing about some of these songs are working. It just, Saint, like, it's one of those albums where I wasn't sure, like, do I like Saint Vincent? Like, I listened, to some of the stuff on the self-titled and, like, Strange Mercy, and I'm like, oh, yeah, I still love Saint Vincent. Like, she's still great. Like, thank God. But there's just something on this album that just, the songs, they just don't grab me, because I think it's Annie going into, this new territory. I mean, the last album, the self-titled, she was kind of, exploring pop music a bit more than her previous work. Was working more synthesizers into the mix, and it worked out really well, because, I mean, she had just come off of working with David Byrne, and so some of that, the David Byrne residue was still with her, and it really worked. But it seems like some of that David Byrne, sort of influence is still there, but just not in the right places where it was on the self-titled. Like, lyrically, AJ was discussing how on every album she's kind of playing a character, and on this album it's sort of like a sensitive dominatrix, because there's a lot of songs, buddy. There's a lot of songs. There's a lot of songs about sex here and dominating in bed on this album.
Especially on Savior.
Oh yeah, Savior is basically all about that, like putting on costumes and like being like, oh, I can't be your savior, dominating you or whatever, like a nurse's outfit or all this shit. But yeah, the weird thing is, like, I'm gonna get some shit for it because it's not the correct take, but I don't really know how else to like express this, because it seems like there's a bit more nuance, but just, it doesn't feel genuine to me. Like, when she's writing these songs about some of these topics, like on Mass Seduction, when she's like, I can't turn off what turns me on, I just go,
I sort of get where you're going with, and like, kind of what I think that partly is that when you have songs on this album like Pills, which are like kind of surface level satire almost, it's hard to buy into the moments on the album that are more seemingly sincere for me.
Yeah, like Los Angeles comes like right after Happy Birthday Johnny. Like, that's like a really rough transition, going from like the sort of like radio rock track that is about how like how much of it like a dominating force I am, and then this really vulnerable piano track, and it seems like it can work to have that balance of like someone who has a very sensitive side, but also is like a dominating personality. She tries to have both, and it can work, but it just doesn't work because the writing is not strong enough, and the track listing is not strong enough. And let me just get more into. Let me check Antonoff. I think this album has fully sort of signified like what I dislike about Jack Antonoff, and it doesn't really have to do with like his own like actual like production or his writing, which is not great. But I think Andy Clark is a strong enough writer that sort of blocks out some of the really awful like Jack Antonoff stuff, because I think the worst parts of this album are like it's on Annie, like, and that's what I'm getting to, is just like Jack Antonoff. His problem isn't like that he's a bad writer or he's a bad producer. He's a bad filter, because he's someone that like, from what I can tell, is someone that is like, I fully support your vision. I'm with you 100% on what you want to do with the songs and with this album. And that kind of hurts it, because that allows bad ideas to flow through. And that's why I wasn't a big fan of Lord's album, is that it just seemed like there's some good songs here, but there's also just like a lot of like really like poorly executed ideas that like with a different producer or a different filter could work better. And that's kind of my problem with this album, is that, like, there are some bad songs here that could have been avoided or could have been, worked better with a different producer. Like, we should mention that John Congleton has a much smaller role in this album. He only does, like, additional production on, like, 3 tracks. Like, I think it's Pills, Fear the Future,
and Savior.
Okay, yeah. And you can actually tell that, like, that Congleton worked on those tracks, but still, and Congleton, and, Congleton was super integral to, like, the St. Vincent sound. Like, Actor is, like, really works because, like, Marry Me is, like, kind of a cutesy album. It's sort of, it's kind of a cutesy album. Doesn't quite have the, it has some of the elements that make, like, that would, later show up on later St. Vincent albums. But there was still some stuff on there that was, like, kind of, like, you could tell that she worked with Sufjan, on his tour, because there was still some of that sort of, like, singer-songwriting type stuff on them, and that kind of faded out a bit on Actor and Strange Mercy, where she really kind of immersed a bit more in rock music and really was sort of finding her own identity as an artist. And this album, it's sort of her, transitioning more into, wanting to make more, like, really, like, going, like, I kind of teased the pop stuff on the last album, but let me just go more full on forward on this album. Like, there's so much more synthesizers, the guitar, there's not as much guitar work, and when it's there, it's not as great. Like, it's just the production is just kind of sterile throughout, like, there is some of that crunchiness that is sort of known for, throughout her work, but it's just like, it's sort of like a recreation of the crunchiness. Like, it doesn't feel like genuine. It's like, oh, like, you're just trying to do the crunchiness, but it just isn't the same. And I don't know, I'm a mess on this album.
I think so first of all, we've talked almost entirely too much about Jack Antonoff in the last calendar year, but that's not really our fault as much as it is him being everywhere. And I think really one of my bigger gripes with Jack Antonoff doesn't really have to do with him as much as it is, I think, especially when there is so much of him on things this year, I don't understand why artists feel the need to do albums that are, like, front to back Jack Antonoff produced. We worked this the whole way through, because the problem is that, like, this album can feel a little samey with the production. Like, I think because he has such a distinct sound, and I think this kind of thing for Melodrama too, it's like when you have someone who has that much of it, like, this is what I do, this is my sound, you shouldn't have the entire album produced by them, because it's gonna lead tracks to blend into each other, and you want to have a cohesive vision, but you also should be, like, bring in other people, like, especially for, like, a pop album, you know what I mean? Like, for an album that's supposed to really grab people's ears, like, Annie could have easily done, like, 7 tracks that were Jack Antonoff joints, and then brought in, like, some other cool, interesting pop producers to kind of give it more of a well-rounded feel to it. I think would have been a better way to, like, go about this, because I think Jack Antonoff has a lot of strengths that he brings to the record, but he has a lot of weaknesses as well. And I think when you have him for an entire album where it's like this is almost equally his vision as much as it is the artist's vision, then when you have that, it kind of, like, it can wear on you a little bit. And also, Matty, I would just like to point out that you are there's that meme where it's like the Dinkelberg face.
Yeah,
from
I know.
Parents,
and I don't
Antonoff.
Antonoff.
I know. I don't quite.
Antonoff.
I don't want to be that guy, because I feel like I was doing that with Lord, and I didn't want to be that way with this album, but it's just like I can't get over his influence on this thing. And again, my opinion is more evolved into, it's just more of, he's just a bad filter more than anything, because he's sort of with an artist 100%, which is sort of for an artist that's a pro, it's like, oh, hey, this guy, like, fully believes in my vision and is, helping me execute it. Isn't that awesome? And it's like, yeah, but, like, he's not going to tell you that your ideas suck sometimes. Like, I just feel like he's just a giant yes man. Like, there's certain, like, I feel like Look What You Made Me Do is a perfect, like, is a pretty perfect example of that, of just, like, there's so many times in that song where he should have said no. He should have said no. Let's not.
I feel like we could talk about the St. Vincent album without having to talk about how bad all of the new Taylor Swift stuff is, just because that's sort of like of course it was going to be,
Okay.
Well, Taylor Swift trying to rap, probably not good.
Okay, let me. Okay, yeah. But let me get back to Mass Seduction, and let me just get, like, as I mentioned, the songs, they just don't quite work, because again, it's Andy Clark trying to do these pop, these more pop songs, but, like, yeah, they're just not that catchy, and it's also the album is just kind of the pacing is kind of off because you'll sort of have these sort of more rockier like these really pop rock tracks like radio rock basically, and then you have a piano ballad afterwards, and it's just like the transitions are kind of rough, and even the more rockier songs like there's just a certain a sterilization to them that just doesn't work. Like I was writing notes for this, and I think the last note I have is that Fear the Future sounds like a bad dubstep remix of a St. Vincent song.
So it's weird that Fear the Future is actually one of my least favorite tracks in this album, considering like kind of the takes that sort of surround it just being like one that sticks out and one that Congleton's influence is like the most apparent on. But I do think it's just like too big and too loud in comparison to like everything else that was sort of happening on it, and it definitely just kind of like sticks out as being like, where did this come from? And maybe like it's because it doesn't jive like the most, but I just find that sort of interesting.
Yeah. And I mean, it should be known that Annie Clark is the co-producer on this album, because like I don't want to.
Her influence is obvious.
The thing is, like, I go to blaming Jack Antonoff because I don't want to blame Annie, because it's like I love St. Vincent and I love Annie's work, and I think she's just is such a great artist. But like I mean, most of the album, like most of my faults with this album, they're on her. It's like she's just the songwriting on this album. It seems like she's in between a rock is like a rock and a hard what's the expression?
It's a rock and a hard place.
A rock and a hard place, where it seems like she's trying to do that transition from going from like the St. Vincent sound, where she found a really nice balance of the pop stuff and what she was doing with David Byrne, and then what she was doing Actor in Strange Mercy, just a really nice balance of like all these elements. But here it's like, okay, well, let's up the pop influence, and let's up the let's up a little bit of that David Byrne sort of satirical edge, and let's downgrade the Strange Mercy Actor stuff, but not too much, and just a bunch of combinations. It just doesn't work as like musically. It's just kind of all over the place. But like nothing, jibes together, because you have these really rocky tracks, but the rocky tracks aren't that good, because it's like I've heard her do these like really rocky kind of poppy type songs, like Birth in Reverse kicks fucking ass and is better than like any track on this album. And then of course you get to the piano ballads, and you're like, they're not bad, but like the party exists. So you have all these things where it's just like you're comparing it to her previous work, and it's like, well, this is not bad, but like she did this. So I know she can do this sound, and she can do it fantastically, but just isn't there. And, it's just this album. It lacks a certain bite that pretty much like all of her previous work had, maybe except for "Marry Me." But like the rock stuff on here doesn't have bite. The more piano ballads, they don't quite hit the emotional chord that they should, and like and then some of the more poppy stuff, like Sugar Boy is like. For me, Sugar Boy is the worst track that she has ever done. Like, that song just fucking sucks.
Bad take. Keep that away from me.
It is so bad. It's so fucking annoying, because you have that fucking, like, arpeggiated, like, synth line, and Sugar Boy.
I love it, baby. I love it.
It's just so...
Sugar Boy is one of the songs I don't mind.
It's so annoying. And then, like, Smoking Section is also just kind of a disappointing outro, because it's like, it has that, like, I mentioned earlier that Fear the Future is like a bad dubstep remix. Smoking Section also has a bit of that, like, it's a bad, like, it has like these weird electronic stuff that just feels like instantly dated. Like, it's like, I heard people doing stuff like this back in like, this is like stuff that like Kanye was doing on like Yeezus, and this just doesn't it doesn't gel. Ugh. I mean, there's not much more I can say. I mean, I forgot to mention. Oh yeah, there's one note I forgot to mention. Like we were talking a bit earlier about like some of the more. There's a lot of stuff about sex in this album. She talks about fucking a little bit, but like
I've heard of it.
But lyrically, but lyrically, reading some of this stuff, it just sounds like. Annie Clark went to Google and typed in BDSM and just clicked on the first result, and then just started writing songs about like what she was reading. Like, it just feels like the sexy songs in here, they just don't quite they don't work, because she isn't like the dominating like force of personality on this album. But it's weird, because it's like, but like on the last album, she was like basically a cult leader, and it fucking worked, because it was like, it came off as really convincing. But for whatever reason on this album, it just doesn't, because the writing isn't as strong. But I I mean, that's. I mean, I have many thoughts, and I don't know how to get them all together. But I'm just not a fan of this album. It's really disappointing, and I don't want to be disappointed because I love Saint Vincent. But this album, man, it's a brick. Should drop the brick on us, or at least on me. Should drop the brick on me for this one.
In summation, we here at the Indie Heads podcast think that Mass Seduction by Saint Vincent is an album.
Yeah, it's
released in the
an
year
album.
2017, and we have thoughts on it. And you just heard quite a bit of them.
A lot of them.
Hang on, I do have. Wait, I forgot. I have one more note on here that I didn't know if I wanted to say it or not. It was the first thing I wrote, but
Get it out quick, buddy.
Okay, this might be my currents of 2017. Like this has that same I get that same feeling listening to it.
And we're gonna leave it at that. All right.
There's no good commentary that comes after that point. Moving on.